welcome to a very special Thursday noontime O'Brien Kidney Center Joint Renal Grand Rounds seminar. And it's my real distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Kevin Fowler, who many of you will probably know from Twitter. He's a celebrity on Twitter, and I had certainly known his name, was very impressed by his presence on Twitter and what he has to say about kidney disease. And then I had the great fortune of meeting him in person for the first time in Washington, D.C. just a couple of weeks ago at the Diabetic Kidney Disease Collaborative Stakeholders Meeting. And at that time, I also was very fortunate to entice him to come and speak with us here at Northwestern. And he's been speaking at a number of different institutions and has a really fabulous message. So just to give you a little bit of background about Kevin, he has a really interesting background, more than a quarter of a century in pharmaceutical industry, where he led a number of different projects and had lots of success in marketing as well as in advocating for patients and getting the patient's voice heard. And he decided to leave the pharmaceutical industry, and in 2014 he started his own consulting business, which is known as the Voice of the Patient, and he has a long list of illustrious clients now: Retrophin, Bayer, Gilead, Veloxis, Otsuka, and Responsum. And in 2017 he was also selected to be the patient editor for Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. Just a little bit of personal information. Kevin had a kidney transplant, a preemptive one, in 2004, so he has a deep passion for patient advocacy and patient engagement. And he is extremely busy. I'm just going to read a couple of the things. In addition to now being tapped for the Diabetic Kidney Disease Collaborative, which we're going to certainly utilize his expertise, he's also on the board of directors of the Kidney Health Initiative at the American Society of Nephrology, the board of directors of the Cardiorenal Society, board of directors, American Association of Kidney Patients, and the Kidney Research Institute Patient Advisory Committee member. So Kevin, we're absolutely delighted you could join us here today, and really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I think I'm going to put this one right here. And beautiful facilities that you have here. And so what I'm going to talk about, this is a talk I gave back in October at the Godiego conference on early intervention and detection of kidney disease. So this will be published, Dr. Quaggan probably knows better than I do, but probably be published mid-year this year. And just to start off the talk, to give you an idea of what I'm going to discuss is, let's see, I'm trying. I guess the key right there, advance? Okay, great. This will be fine. So these are just the organizations, just disclosures. These are organizations I've received compensation from. But what I'd like to talk about, just to kind of set the frame for today, is these are the four areas I'd like to talk about. And what I purposely did is tried to identify some areas where I think that there's maybe an opportunity to add this to the field, to advance the field of nephrology. I'm going to start off with talking about our family generational experience with polycystic kidney disease. And not so much our narrative, but try to understand how narratives influence behavior in families. The second one is just to talk about where I see opportunities in patient engagement and then where I see as barriers. I'm going to pay homage to my nephrologist, who is one of the more important people in my life, Brent Miller. And then what I look at really is a business and moral case for early detection and intervention of CKD. Its relevance not just in terms of new therapeutics, but also for transplant, where some of the new treatments may be. And then I think how all this is linked back to advancing the field of nephrology. I think they're all linked back together. So this is actually a picture of my grandfather. This was actually, my family's from St. Louis, but this time they're living in West Virginia. And right there next to him is my mom. My mom was the oldest of three daughters. And so I picked this picture out because, looking at the photograph, neither one knew they had polycystic kidney disease. My grandfather was the first one we were aware of that had polycystic kidney disease. Has anybody here had any experience personally with it, not professionally? Anyone here have a family member connected to it? Good. is that, that was really where our journey started by what my mom and what my grandfather went through. And so when my grandfather had the disease, he actually didn't find out until he was, actually, let me slow down for a second. So this is actually a picture in St. Louis in the 1950s. And if you look at my grandfather wearing the fedora, to his right are his 3 daughters. And all 3 of those daughters end up getting polycystic kidney disease, and all 3 died on dialysis. When he himself went in there, they didn't know what polycystic kidney disease, he was just feeling bad, and he went to the hospital, and he was he was going through uremic poisoning, and afterwards they found out they had polycystic kidney disease. So back in the late 1950s, dialysis wasn't available. But the reason I picked this out is that, in our family, I think that when you have different diseases, narratives develop. And the disease certainly impacted my mom, where she saw how it impacted her dad. But for whatever reason, my mom chose to be much more optimistic about her life. Her 2 sisters just always had a black cloud over them. But the reason I talk about is that, if you think about different communities that you're treating, like diabetic kidney disease, do you really have a good understanding what those narratives are? Because I think those narratives really do influence behavior, and I don't think many people spend a lot of time on that. So if you look at it as the disease progressed, my mom actually found out in 1965, right after she had her 3rd child, my sister Joanne. And I mean, this is hard to believe this happened, but this is 1965, and when the doctor told her that she had polycystic kidney disease, he said, you should have had that baby, because that's going to reduce your life. Now, can you imagine someone saying that? But that's hard to say. That's what she experienced when she was diagnosed. So when she had the disease, it was always kind of something there that was in the back of your mind. But, eventually she went into renal failure. But when she went on dialysis, I mean, that picture really captures her essence. What I always try to tell people, too, is that when, disease does not impact one person, it affects families, right? And sometimes generations. And so, when I saw that, I was a person that tended to internalize and not share a lot. But when I saw what she was going through, it really made a big impact later on in some of my own behavior in terms of the fear that I led through. So when my mom started, though, this was actually in 1981, and when she started dialysis, and when she was on dialysis, it really wasn't clear what the future was going to be. And, right now, that really hasn't changed in a lot of respects, right? If you saw the article that came out in JAMA by Dr. O'Hare from Seattle, people start dialysis today, and they have this overly optimistic viewpoint of what's going to happen to them. So think about this. This is 1981. We're now the year 2020, and it hasn't changed, the risk. So, but the one thing I was very grateful for is that she set a great example, as well as my dad. He set a great example. And so my mom started dialysis, and you look at her, she was actually doing pretty well. This is 2 months afterwards on dialysis, hemodialysis. And one thing about hemodialysis that I think that did exist back then, I felt was much more compassionate. If you may not be aware of this, but back at that time, dialysis was staffed primarily by nurses, not technicians. And there was a real difference I saw in terms of it. So from my perspective, I saw much more compassion then than what I've heard from other people today, just to be honest. And so when she was on dialysis, again, there was a message in the family. It's like, where's this all going? We really didn't know. And as it advanced, you could see, these are back in the days before you had Epogen, but the disease really began to take an impact on my mom's quality of life. Here are my 2 sisters here, the fatigue, the back pain, the headache. I mean, she never complained. And I'm so grateful for that because of the example it set for me. But those same characteristics that existed then, the uncertainty and not knowing, it still exists today. It hasn't changed much. So that experience really had a profound impact upon me. But I chose a path to just keep my head buried in the sand. Because why? The narrative back then, in some cases, was if you have PKD, there's nothing you can do. And that's not, obviously, was false. But that narrative did influence my behavior. So back in my 20s and 30s, up until 40, I was drinking beer, a lot of beer. And so at this point, I really didn't know. I didn't want to, because the message was you don't want to get tested because there's nothing to do. It's going to hurt your insurance. and there's a lot of negative consequences find out. So this was actually, I was a sales manager for Pfizer in St. Louis. This is at Tower Grove Park. And as a sales manager, the sales reps had bought us a family portrait. So this was taken with my wife, Kathy. We've been married 5 years. There's my son, Jack. He's, at that point, he's 8 months old. And Kelly is staring at like another bunny or something. She's got that wide look. And she was a little less than 3 years old at that point. And I picked out that photo is because 2 months later, I started having really bad back pain. And I thought the back pain was attributable to lifting some items in the house. And but finally at this point, I'd had a life insurance policy, so I had the confidence to do this. I went to my doctor and I said, I'd like to be tested for PKD. Now, up until that time, my primary care doctor said, you're doing great. He said, there's not much you can really do. There's not really a need to see a nephrologist, but your kidney function's fine, nothing to worry about. So I made that request before the beginning of 2001, and then I went to make the appointment, and I saw the doctor. He does ultrasound. I could see his body language, and he says, well, you'll be on dialysis in 3 years. And I said, you're just the same guy that just told me that I was in good shape, right? So, you have different moments in your life. I think I alluded to earlier when I started on my own in 2014, where you see things very clearly where you have to intervene in your life. And in that situation, he was equating dialysis and transplant as being equal treatments. And from my own personal experience, I knew that much it wasn't. So I made the choice to not take his referral and find and contact a friend of mine to make a referral. So thank goodness for that friend, Brian DeGraff. I had an appointment with Brent Miller. Many of you may know Dr. Miller. He's at the University of Indiana. I had my first appointment with him with a lot of trepidation and fear. This is March 6th, ironically, on my mom's birthday. And she had been obviously deceased, and I met with Dr. Miller, immediately liked him. And I always go back to this about, nephrologist, is that I know he's a smart guy, but the reason I liked Brent so much, he was a really good communicator. He understood me. He was a good coach, and he set high expectations, right? So, in fact, he's got a great sense of humor, so that when I would be getting stressed out, my wife and I would be, fighting over the stress, he was always good at just trying to kind of keep things level-based. And so when I saw him, the first thing he says to me, oh, this is not a big deal. You're going to have a preemptive transplant. I'm like, what's preemptive transplant? So that fear that I had prevented me from understanding the different things were happening. And if you're thinking about right now, there's so many people with kidney disease are living with fear, but you contrast that with a future that's being created, which is so incredibly bright, there's an opportunity to bridge those two groups. So I was extremely fortunate, less than 2% at that time, of having a preemptive transplant. And I just had I always say this, I said this to Dr. Quaggan earlier, is that if I think about people in my life who made the biggest impact, he's in the category, right? So when I think about all these people I've come in contact, frankly, that you've worked with that really, in many cases, were so inconsequential, even though you worked for 10 years, this is a person that really changed the direction of our life. And it's not just my life, but our full family's life. So if I look at the catalyst for patient engagement, I mean, these are just my thoughts on this, is that if someone, I think it all starts with physician communication. In the case of Dr. Miller, he had an intuitive understanding of myself that in terms of how to work with me and motivate me. And that the role that I really viewed, and this is something you may want to take a look at. I don't know if anyone here is called situational leadership, but I was a manager for over 13 years. And there's a model that you work with people that you manage is that you want to move them to different quadrants. And the whole goal is to have them become self-directed, just like our kids, hopefully. And I think what was he was so great is that he had set the end in mind. He says, this is what's going to happen. This is what you need to do. You need to start really making sure you're exercising. You got to stop the beer. But he said at the end, he said to me, you're going to do fine because I know who you are and how you respond to this. And he set that vision. And that is sometimes I don't see that being done. And he was so powerful putting together that. So I think that's where I look at from patient engagement. And this is actually this wonderful picture of me coming home here. This is actually August of 2004. And, I'll talk about, and John, I've talked this about him too, but there's also a part two where I think talk about some of the challenges with the journey. And the main thing is that the value of having that self-referral, it gave me 3 years of time with that kidney. That was a lifetime, If I had been able to participate in a trial or delayed, I would have done it. It just wasn't available. But those 3 years that I gave myself by being detected, were able to provide a living donor and provide myself optimal outcomes. When I look at myself in terms of taking a look at where I'm at today, 15 years and a half later, I view myself as someone who's been successfully rehabilitated with kidney disease. But I would just ask the question to you, looking at the people that have kidney disease, how many people are actually rehabilitated that have kidney disease? And I'll go back to it, but I think that's where one thing as a community, I think that is an opportunity to improve, especially with the direction. And so for me at that point in time, the biggest things I were worried about were 2 things. How long am I going to be around? Is my wife going to be stuck raising the kids by herself? And I want to work. Those were my motivations. That was it. So maybe as a guy or whatever, my connection to working was such a part that if I couldn't work, that was going to be a tough one. So I looked at that, and I looked at myself, and I say that I was successfully rehabilitated. But I always point this out, too, and I know Northwestern is doing some work here with Dr. Leventhal to take a look at immunosuppression-free therapy, which is really good to hear. I think there's a real need for that. But I look at the life that I was given was a life of gratitude, but it was a life of risk that you learn how to manage. And one thing I always share with everyone is if I were to give you one area that I think that is really not understood in nephrology, the emotional part. So the implied message at Barnes Hospital, no disrespect to them, be lucky you got the transplant, be lucky you're alive, now move on with your life, right? And the unfortunate part is at that point in time, I had 2 young kids, and I really was rocking myself saying, how long am I going to be around? And that took about a year to kind of figure that out and come to peace. And then the other thing, too, is truthfully, is the medications are very toxic. So if you combine those different elements, I say this very honestly, I went through a really dark period, severe depression, and really kind of felt alone. And I think that that's not uncommon with many people that have different forms of kidney disease. But I would just say is that if I would give you one suggestion is just to think about the emotional part and the need to have patient-reported outcome measures that don't exist to the same extent. So that was the path. And if I look at where the barriers are to patient engagement, I think now we're in a very, looking at things prospectively, there's a system of care now being developed that's really going to serve kidney disease patients. But when I would talk with people that were very senior in CMS, and I would ask them a question, why are people not engaged with their care? I don't know. I can tell you why they weren't, because they weren't given much input into their care. My opinion. The other part, too, I would just ask you, too, is to think about is the family narratives. And so maybe diabetic kidney disease or any other diseases that you're serving, do you really know the narrative? I don't see narrative medicine having as strong as presence in kidney disease as I do, let's say, in other areas like oncology. And then I think that, truthfully, when we met with Secretary Azar, who's, changed the system, the reimbursement incentives have had a perverse impact on care. That's changing. And I think that in many areas, I think the role of expectations, not making assumptions based upon someone with their education level, literacy level, race, whatever. But I think that the whole part is about when I would manage people was expecting a lot from them. And for me, I responded to that because I viewed my doctor as a coach, and I wanted to be around. And so I think that sometimes I would just say to you, those are things that I view as potential barriers. And I'm a big history buff, and I love history, and I actually learned a lot about this. But if you go back to the days when nephrology became a really hot profession back in the early 1960s with Dr. Scribner out in Seattle, is that if you go back and look at the early days of dialysis, Dr. Scribner said that if we put people on dialysis and they're not rehabilitated, we failed. And if you go back and take a look at that, it was all predicated upon patient engagement. When people were doing dialysis at home, they had to be engaged with their health care. And I think when the market then became consolidated with the 2 large organizations, grabbing a large market share, I think that really had a negative impact. And so I would just say to me is that, Dr. Scribner was a prophet. And like most prophets are ignored. But he knew what was going to happen in the future. Even though that the legislation that was approved in 1973 was approved with the best intentions, the ESRD benefit. I think he saw through what was going to happen many years later, and he was right. So I would just say to you is that as we move forward with kidney disease, ask the question about rehabilitation. And as we move towards the final part of the presentation, looking at the numbers, I think it's always important, I've advised this to clients I work with, is that kidney disease is a disease of disparities. If you're African American, the disparities exist all the way across the spectrum, from detection to transplant, across the board. And I also just, and I have to say I'm really kind of surprised, but I've actually advised companies about this. They weren't thinking this. And I think it's a chance to go to good. I will just also mention the point, too, is that while the trends are encouraging with reducing the incidence of kidney disease, I do want to emphasize a point that is a big issue, and this is the one that I think I have a hard time with, is that how could you have 13% of the people that are African American represent 35% of dialysis patients? And more importantly, why is there no outrage over that? And so I say I compare that experience to my experience, but when we look at, and that's why, working with diabetic kidney disease, I really have a lot of interest because of it. But I would just say to this is that, looking at this issue, we do have treatments right now that are approved for these conditions. I'll bypass this, everyone knows these numbers. But if you look at the study that was done by University of Minnesota and Jason, I think it was back in January, or maybe it was January of last year. But if you look at utilization of ACE and ARBs in chronic kidney disease, they really have plateaued. And there was actually a study done by Kathy Tuttle and Susan Nicholas that was in JAMA that showed actually the utilization is actually lower. So my question is why? I was at a meeting, the National Kidney Foundation, when doctors were complaining about costs of SGLT2 inhibitors. And I said, hey, wait a minute, let's get real here. There's no cost issues here. I understand acute kidney injury is an issue, but why aren't they being used? So I just say, what are the reasons why this is? And if you understand a little frustration in my voice, I'm sorry. I read a lot, I get frustrated, so it's nothing personal, but it keeps me motivated. And then I would just say is that I think if you take a look at all these other elements that have happened, and I'll be very honest with you, I think what the large dialysis organizations were doing is they were trying to turn nephrology into a commodity. I get the playbook. I know the game you're playing. And that's what was happening, in my opinion, is they're trying to commoditize nephrology. And so I think if you look at the byproduct of the system it had, and I'll say this is looking retrospectively, but looking at prospectively, many of you here are aware of these numbers. And there was actually a study done in Kidney International Report that looked at people that were considering nephrology. Some of these same areas were mentioned, and one mentioned a couple different times was the role of dialysis, not viewing that as offering as much value to people who have kidney disease. No disrespect for doctors here that specialize in dialysis, but I'm just trying to think about a future where we begin to celebrate that rather than celebrating DaVita opening up another dialysis center, we celebrate them closing. Then I know we've made progress. So I look at these areas and I say is that these areas are all linked together to the future of nephrology. And what really excites me too is that if you look at the opportunity in front of us, right, there's people doing tremendous work in these areas, the Kidney Health Initiative, Kidney Precision Project, the executive order. And the part that I find, I had someone from the Washington Post contact me, and he was all talk about dialysis and transplant. And I said, what about the early detection? Media doesn't even understand this. And most people don't understand the significance of that to change everything. And I think that there's a really powerful message, but the message is still not getting out to all the people. And then I always say is that I think if you want to look at the way to model patient engagement is the American Society of Nephrology, the way that they've developed the patient and family partnership through Celeste Castillo's leadership. But ASN is leading the way that if you want to learn how to do it better, ASN is doing that. So from my standpoint, I really am excited for the future, for the people that are going to follow myself. I think the future is really, really bright. And then also the surrogate endpoints in kidney disease and clinical trials. So I was able to participate in these meetings, just blown away by people that gave up a lot of their time to do this work. But this also is going to provide a pathway, I think, for further innovation. But I also am surprised, too, when talking to physicians, that many times physicians are not aware of surrogate endpoints as well. And there's a pushback that trials need to be longer. speaking from the pharma perspective, it's probably not too pragmatic, right? But I would just say I think this is another incredibly positive message. If you are curious, we had myself and 4 other people provide a commentary on this subject. And then I think if you look at the therapeutic, interventions on the horizon, there's a lot. I think now you're starting to see people looking at subtypes in there. Diabetic kidney disease is being understood now as much of the genetic basis and understanding that can take a personalized approach. So if I look at all these interventions that can delay the time to renal failure, I can't tell you how devastating it was when I was told that I was going into renal failure. I thought my life was over at 39. And when I hear people talk about going to dialysis like it's not a big deal, I just ask you if you ever had a family member, and I've had 3 of them go through it. It's just not good. And so I think where this gets me excited about where the future is going towards early intervention, and that's going to raise everyone up, including transplant. And so I like to read. I would just say is that, this is nothing really breathtaking in scope what I'm offering here. But has anyone read this book? Yeah, I would look at this as a blueprint for nephrology. And just, it's an amazing story of people that, if you look at the trajectory of time they spent to make sacrifice, it's really it's an amazing, beautiful story. But I would just say is that, and I think that these are things that are happening right now, that nephrology is moving towards patient-centered. I think the one thing that is not occurring, though, are risk-benefit conversations. I can certainly tell you that. I do that in transplant. Those conversations aren't going on, and people are not being educated. But I think that those are conversations that need to become much more honest with patients and have their ability to weigh those decisions. And then I would say, I think innovation's headed. I think nephrology certainly is trailing now, but I think it has a chance to really catch up. But for all this to succeed with the executive order, it's got to be about patient engagement. I'm happy to see that CMS is identified that. They have advisors serving with them, and the advisors have said to them, you've got to invest in patient engagement. Because if this comes down where you have doctors pushing transplant because of incentives, it's got to come this way for it to be sustainable. So I appreciate you providing me the opportunity to share my perspective. I hope at least Scott took one thing away from today's presentation. So thank you for the opportunity. Oh, of course.
So you mentioned right there the answer. I'd love to hear your take on the incentive. So with some of the new proposals that are going on yet, but the incentive for a successful at least 3-year outcome.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? How do you think that could be improved?
So first of all, moving to 3 years from 1 year, that's great, positive, right? And making transplant more of a priority. John, where I just see is that where my biggest concern is how we intervene with people earlier with education, right? So earlier about detection, and how do we just find a way to make sure, because information's out there, but how do we start telling them all their different options so that we start looking at a longer trajectory? That would be my biggest suggestion on that, is just who's owning the education, and how do we make sure it's being done and hold people accountable? Go. So it's the grateful. I got 2 L's to differentiate. 08, 05, 04. That was the day of my transplant. Okay. Sure. Yeah, what I would suggest is there's my suggestion is I think it's just a matter of people caring. Right? I don't matter whether it's white or black, whatever. There's a couple of my friends that I'm happy to refer you to. They're part of our PFPC because it's a big issue that we really haven't addressed. I'm off of that role now, but I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation with you. I think the main thing is this is my experience. You care. You're real. And then have a relationship that exists over a period of time versus driving your agenda and then saying, bye-bye. Anyway. That's because I do it based upon with recruiting for clinical trials. My approach is I'm embedded in the community because there's distrust, whether African American, whatever. but you've got to earn the respect of people so that they're going to trust you. Anyway, no easy ways around it. So. Yep.
So I'd be.
Yes.
So I was.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of recruiting, I would just say is like, I think the whole thing about clinical trials, right, is it goes back to, I think, one, risk benefit, right? That the risk of kidney disease and dialysis, that needs to be better understood by people. So recognize that people are able to handle that. I think that trying to get people to understand is what the benefit of that trial is and explain to people what the benefit, what that can mean in terms of additional time with that kidney, right? And then that gives you time then to maybe have a living donation, right? And getting them to think about a longer period of time as a continuum of what value that could bring. My experience has been the most effective way to work with different trials is go back to what I've done is the way I've always served myself as a bridge with the patient community, and then I'll knock on the doors of physicians and I'll talk about the trial. And many of them just don't know about the trial. And then I think just try to create an urgency to make sure their patients are aware of the trial. But I think it's like if you look at a trial and you take a look at it, and I'm not going to do a trial unless I believe in what the value is, right? And I think it's just a matter of conviction of what you're doing, explaining things honestly what the risk and benefit is, no guarantees, but then let them make the decision. And more times than not, when you allow them to do that, they're probably going to do it. I mean, I gave this example earlier too for Fabry disease. Fabry disease is an absolutely awful disease if you know anyone that's ever had it. We had a patient advisory meeting. We were recruiting for Fabry disease, and I had a guy disabled, walked with a cane. He took a bus to get to the airport to fly 3 hours to a meeting to learn about a new clinical trial. So I always say when you're trying to find solutions, the patient's not the problem. Look otherwise. And I think that a lot of it just goes back to the messaging. I hate to say it, but a lot of it's almost like sales, right? In terms of what your message is, the clarity of it, and I think just how you treat people, as a stakeholder. And that's the challenge I face a lot with companies is getting them to view people that are in these trials as equal stakeholders. So. So I think in terms of branding, right? So I would just say is that I think that so one there's a study out there that shows that you could talk to from ASN, but overall nephrology is slow to adopt to innovation. So that's established. So I think that part of it is a branding issue because when you take a look at totality of all the things that are happening out there, there's a really compelling story for nephrology, really compelling. And I think it's just getting people away from that one that they've been fixated upon, on dialysis, which drove the system, and start telling this other story. Because I mean, when I see in my mind, it's very clearly is that there's some of these diseases that people are never going to go in renal failure, or if they do, they may have a transplant with no immunosuppression. I just think that story is not being told, and I think it has to be told in a very ASN. I think has to take a role with that, in my opinion. Maybe with AST as well. There's a great story there, and I think that's going to get people excited about things too. Exactly. Yeah, and I think that this has come up with a couple other people, like, would it be possible to have a specialty, in preventive nephrology, right? I mean, that's something that there's people out there that would be certainly able to help advocate for that. I think that, that's just one suggestion I have is to that, because I mean, if you really step back and think about where this is all going to go, I mean, this field's going to be radically different. I think now's the time to start working upon developing a subspecialty on preventive nephrology. Yep. But I think what you do, if you look at the people that have kidney disease, it's been a population that has really been kind of asleep. If you go back and look at history, the community was very active back in the 70s. And I think for the consolidation had a lot of negative consequences, put it that way. I think that's where I would spend my time with, is engaging in doing that. Because if you do that, that will build a sustainable model for everything. So I think that's what as a strategy, that's what I would advocate, doing that. And I'll just say this too, is that when I was recruiting for this other clinical trial, I saw like a pharmaceutical company kind of take out the dialysis model where they create this quote unquote dependency upon them. So I think in the end, where you really win is getting people to stand on their own 2 feet and invest there. That everyone's going to win that way. Because I agree with these advisors. If you start saying, I want you to do this, if you can start bringing this way, I know it's harder, but in the long run, it's going to work better. So. Yeah, no questions off base. So my daughter's 22. She'll be graduated in May. Hopefully, I'll see that. And then my son is 20. You know what I've done is that with PKD is I think that I've just tried to show by example that this hasn't limited me. And so they don't view me as a patient. I just keep telling them that a lot of the work that I'm doing, that if they do have this, the future's going to be better. But talking to physicians, I talked to Ron Perone about this, and he said, there's no real incentive to do this right now. So I think the best thing I did learn from my mom is set an example for them to follow. But they think about once in a while, but I said, if you do, it's going to be so much better. Don't get caught for that. You got to live now. So I don't know how much it's working, but I'd like them to make that decision rather than me, just from talking to Ron Perone about that. That's a big topic there. So. Yeah, a lot of them. Yeah, I mean, I think that. So one thing I take a look at is that I think trying to understand, if you're a physician, right, that you have different patient populations that have different needs. So when I was at St. Louis, Dan Brennan would be telling me all the time, you take your meds, you take your meds. I said, Dan, could you just stop for a second? I mean, do you know how, I am about understanding anything? Do you think I'm not going to take my meds? So I think that, if you go back to like the situational leadership when I was working with, managing people, is if you can begin to kind of figure out, like, segment your patient population, right? There's some people out there don't need a lot of help. And there's actually a decent number out there. There's some that are going to need more resources, but I look at it as a coaching model. If you understand the population and then change your communication so it's coaching, I think that's a better use of your time. Because what I saw a lot of times with Dan Brennan, it's just the same thing all the time. And I'm like, Dan, I know that. So that would be my 2 cents. That. Yeah, I think a lot of it starts with your doctor. I mean, I really, I do. I'll give you another example. So I gave the example I had there with Dr. Brennan with his interpersonal skills. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, went to the University of Chicago, and I met with this doctor, and I just, I knew his incentives were aligned with mine, but just the whole way he approached it, he just like with Dr. Miller, he said, well, you could do this, that. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I would do exactly what you're doing, but it was just it started with respect. And I've only had a couple doctors, one young guy do it, and I said, hey, buddy, you're not talking to me that way. But I think it just starts where, and whoever the person is, right? It just starts with that part. And that, of understanding that there's no one who wants to do better than I do, than you do, But I think that's where it starts, is communication. And I think that's where nephrology could spend more time, just spending time on communication training, a lot of these softer skills. Because, once I was pointing the direction, I didn't need to be told something twice. So anyway. Oh.
Really fabulous.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Glad you're happy.